All right, if you've got your copy of Scripture, we're going to be in Daniel chapter 6, and it's the story that everybody's been waiting for. It's Daniel in the lion's den, right? We all know this one. So as we come to this tonight, as always, one of the things that we want to kind of make sure that we're dealing with is to remember where we are, to remember what's going on, and to see how God's at work. We kind of break Daniel up and we do, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We do the vegetables, we do the lion's den. And I was kind of joking at lunch today with Lon and with Philip. If Daniel hadn't had the lion's den, he would have been known for vegetables. It had been like Daniel and vegetables. That's not something we can really get behind, right? But Daniel and the lion's den. And so we kind of separate all these things and think that they're not interconnected when in reality, God is working through these situations and through these people's lives to speak to people who are far from him. We've seen up until this point with Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar and now tonight Darius, that God is speaking to people who are far from him to show who he is and to draw them to himself and to save multitudes of people. And unfortunately, that these kings and these people continue to reject God. And tonight's no different. We're going to see God reaching out to Darius. Now, a couple of weeks ago, we had a transition of power, so you kind of know where we are, and we'll talk more about this in a minute. Babylon is not in control of the Babylonian kingdom anymore. At the end of Daniel chapter 5, Belshazzar was overthrown by Darius, and it was a pretty amazing deal. Darius and his army came in at night. They overthrew the capital city of Babylon, and at that point, the entire kingdom fell because that city fell in one night. They got all of the rulers, they got all of the important people, and overnight, they transitioned. And now Persia is in power, and we're going to talk more about that. And so the funny thing here is, God doesn't stop. God doesn't stop the mission that he started with Nebuchadnezzar. He is still reaching out to a foreign king to show him who he is, to prove himself to him, and have this king to follow him. And so we're going to see some of that tonight. So let's read in Daniel chapter 6. If you have questions, as always, don't hesitate to ask. We love questions and discussion. So let's do that. Daniel chapter 6. It seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, that they would be in charge of the whole kingdom, and over them 3 commissioners, of whom Daniel was one, that these satraps might be accountable to them, and that the king might not suffer loss. Then this Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit, and the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. Then the commissioners and satraps began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to government affairs, but they could find no ground of accusation or evidence of corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful, and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. Then these men said, "We will not find any ground of accusation against this Daniel unless we find it against him with regard to the laws of his God." Then these commissioners and satraps came by agreement to the king and spoke to him as follows: "King Darius, live forever. All the commissioners of the kingdom, the prefects, the satraps, the high officials, the governors, have consulted together that the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it may not be changed, according to the laws of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked." Therefore, King Darius signed the document, that is the injunction. Now, when Daniel knew that the document was signed, he entered his house. Now in his roof chamber, he had windows open toward Jerusalem. He continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God, as he had been doing previously. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and supplication before his God. They approached and spoke before the king about the king's injunction. "Did you not sign an injunction that any man who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days is to be cast into the lion's den?" And the king replied, "The statement is true, according to the laws of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked." Then they answered and spoke before the king. "Well, Daniel, who's one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the injunction which you have signed, but keeps making his petitions 3 times a day." Then as soon as the king heard this statement, he was deeply distressed. He set his mind on delivering Daniel. And even until sunset, he kept exerting himself to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, "Recognize, O king, that this is a law of the Medes and Persians, that no injunction or statute which the king establishes may be changed." The king gave the orders, and Daniel was brought in and cast into the lion's den. The king spoke and said to Daniel, "Your God, whom you constantly serve, will himself deliver you." A stone was brought and laid over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet rings of his nobles, so that nothing would be changed in regard to Daniel. Then the king went off to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no entertainment was brought before him, and his sleep fled from him. Then the king arose at dawn and the break of day, went in haste to the lion's den. When he had come near the den to Daniel, he cried out with a troubled voice. The king spoke and said to Daniel, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions?" Daniel spoke to the king, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they've not harmed me. Inasmuch as I was found innocent before him, and also toward you, O king, I've committed no crime." The king was very pleased and gave orders for Daniel to be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him, because he had trusted in God. The king then gave orders, and they brought those men who had maliciously accused Daniel. They cast them and their children and their wives into the lion's den, and they had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Then Darius the king wrote to all the people, the nations, and men of every language who were living in the land, "May your peace abound. I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and enduring forever. His kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. His dominion will be forever. He delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has also delivered Daniel from the power of the lions." So this Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So, some things we know and some things we're familiar with, but I want to kind of talk about a couple of things before we jump into Daniel's story, and that are important. You may not think they're important in the beginning, but we want to talk about these. So, who in the world is Darius the Mede? We start this chapter, and it starts talking about Darius the Mede. Now, the reason I want to bring this up is this is a place where people attack the Bible. Specifically, they attack right here the book of Daniel and say, this was not written by Daniel. This was not written during the time of when Daniel would have lived. This was written hundreds and hundreds of years later. In fact, some people put it like during the time of Jesus and say that's how far away that this was written. And so they say, and the reason that we say that is because there was no such king in Babylon or Persia named Darius the Mede. And they're right. They're right, because the king in Persia at this time is Cyrus the Great. And so we need to answer this question. Who is this Darius guy? And why does the Bible call him that? Well, this Darius guy is actually a relative of Cyrus the Great. His name was Ugbaru. He's the son of Asastasius, a relative of Cyrus. He was actually a general. He was a general in Cyrus's army. He was some kind of relative. We're not really sure if it's a nephew, cousin. That kind of language is kind of weird. But here's the deal. What happens, this guy Ugbaru takes the name Darius. Darius is a royal name in the Persian government. And you're going to find out there is another Darius we're going to talk about in a minute. But he takes this name Darius the Mede as a representation of Cyrus. Now, he's not the king. He's not the king of Babylon. Cyrus is. But what happens is, and we're going to see this in just a second, Cyrus appoints him as like a governor over this area, and then he comes in and appoints people under him to govern all the places around them to kind of keep control over this massive Babylonian empire that we had at this moment. We're going to talk about that in a second. But they called him king. It's the same thing we see in the New Testament when you have King Herod, who's ruling in Israel, when in fact the Roman government is ruling Israel. So he's king in the sense that they allow him to have power, but he's not the king. Does that make sense? He's kind of like a territorial governor, and he does whatever the Roman government tells him to do, and they allow him to stay there and do that. This is what's happening with this guy, Darius the Mede. So his name is Ugbaru, and he changes it to Darius. He also became ruler for Cyrus in their transition of power. This is a really smart thing that they do. They've sent their army hundreds and thousands of miles away from where they are, and they go in and they wipe out this massive city, and now you've got all these other provinces and cities underneath the Babylonian Empire that they've got to, exert control over. So he puts this guy there. You're my representative here, and I want you to set up a system so that we can control this area till I can come in and take it over. Now, here's the cool thing about this. Guy was 62 years old at the time he did this. He was 62 years old. He's one of the premier generals of the Persian army, destroys this massive, or doesn't destroy, but takes over this massive city, becomes governor to transition the power to Persia, and they develop a system to govern. And we're going to look at that in a second. Now, he's not to be confused with Darius, the son of Xerxes, in the book of Esther. There is an actual Darius who was an actual king that we see in archaeology and history. And that's where people say, well, see, the Bible's got it confused. They're talking about Darius here, but Darius doesn't come till 53 years later. No, not the same guy. And all of this overlaps, but all this is stuff kind of happening at the same time. We have Xerxes, who's in control over Persia. He comes after Cyrus, many years after Cyrus. He takes control over Persia. He's the Xerxes that we talk about in the book of Esther, who's a really bad dude. And he has a son, Darius, who we talk about in the book of Esther. So not the same people, okay? And this is important. I just want you guys to know this because you'll watch a program on National Geographic or you'll hear somebody talk about it and they'll just say, yeah, you can't trust the Bible. And one of the reasons you can't trust the Bible is they don't know who Darius is. And you can say, but I know who Darius is. So not to be confused with that guy. And one of the things that we have to understand, just like in our world, I wish there was nobody else named Michael in the world. I wish I was the only one. Unfortunately, it's not, right? Does that give us any problem if I'm a Michael and somebody else is a Michael and whatever? It doesn't give us any problem. But sometimes we look back in history and we say, oh, there's people with the same name. How do we know it's not the same person? Well, like history and time and, like ages, like this guy was 62 when he started ruling. He's not going to be ruling 53 years later, like unless he's got the fountain of youth that we don't know about, right? I don't know why that becomes such a big deal, but it becomes a big deal when we start to get shook up about it. So here's the deal. Just like now, there's common names that people name their kids. And you have a lot of them. In the 70s, in 1975, when I was born, Michael was a super popular name. And I hated it because I go to class and there'd be 95 Michaels in my class, right? And Lon does not have that problem. He does not. Different name. But so I just want to give you that so that you would understand if somebody comes along and says that, and you're like, no, this is what's happening, this is who it is, and this is where we are. So, done with our history lesson. So let's talk about the peaceful transfer of power that we're going to find in the first part of this chapter 6. Darius appoints 3 commissioners and 120 satraps over the kingdom. Now I want you to think about that. He basically, what he does, he comes in and he says, okay, I'm the governor, king, and I'm setting up a system so that we can continue to rule these people and so that roads still happen, the economy's still happening, everything's still going on. I don't want anything to stop. And so we're going to be taking you people and you're going to be ruling over these areas, but you're going to be ruling under me. So we have Darius, and then we have 3 commissioners. Daniel is one of them. We don't know who the other 2 are. And then we have another 120 people to cover all of the provinces that they have. Now, I want you to think about that. Think about the size of the kingdom, that you need 120 guys to go spread out over this kingdom to be able to keep the kingdom where it needs to be. Now, another little fact you're not going to care about, but I do, and I'm going to give it to you anyway, okay? This is not to be confused when we talk about Esther, where in Esther, 127 provinces come to throw a party. When Xerxes throws his massive party, they have 127 provinces. You have to understand, this is after this, many years after this, and now they have 127 people ruling over this massive Persian Babylonian kingdom, right? So those don't confuse those. There's 2 different things. So he does this. And as always, Daniel stands out. And so what we see here is, Daniel kind of sets himself apart, and the king, Darius, the governor, Darius, is considering to say, you know what? This guy is so awesome. This guy is so good. I think I'm going to just set him above everybody else. So it'll be me, him, 3 commissioners, 120 satraps, and whoever else that we need locally to make sure that things are happening. Now, if you're one of those satraps, or if you're one of those 3, are you excited that Daniel's getting picked over you again? And remember, when we left Daniel off, do you know how old Daniel is now? He's 83. He's 83 years old. He's not the 12, 13, 14, 15-year-old kid that we saw in Daniel chapter 1. He's been here for over 70 years, or right around 70 years. And, and he's been elevated and elevated and elevated and elevated and elevated. It's kind of like every time something happens, you can imagine them saying, okay, here comes Daniel again. Now, we get to Daniel chapter 5, and Daniel's kind of been out of the picture for a while, right? He's in retirement. This Belshazzar guy doesn't want to listen to Daniel, doesn't, bring him in, doesn't have the counsel of Daniel, doesn't want anything to do with him. And now he's back. And these guys are mad. Now, the reason that he does this, to set this thing up, is not just a peaceful, transfer of power. It is that. But really, it's so the king might not suffer loss. That Cyrus, the Persian king, has spent a lot of time, money, and effort to take over Babylon. And basically, this guy's like, hey, I don't want my king and I don't want my kingdom to suffer loss. Now, I want you to think about something. When a nation has been taken over by a foreign nation and the power is being transferred and, you've got to move, it's not like today where we can just fly stuff over, you're moving things across land and sea and all this kind of stuff. Why do you think he does this? It says that they wouldn't suffer loss. What kind of loss would they suffer? It's not a trick question. What do you think? What better time to rob a nation blind than when you're transitioning power, right? So here's what he's doing. Like, hey, we don't want this thing to get out of control. And so we're going to put all these people in there together and make them accountable to him. So Daniel distinguished himself and he was about to be promoted and these guys got mad. Now, I love this. Look at verse 3. It says, Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners, the satraps, because he possessed an extraordinary spirit. And the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. Then the commissioners and satraps began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to government affairs, but they could find no ground of accusation or evidence of corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful, and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. And then they said, well, we will not find any ground or accusation against this Daniel unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God. So I want you to see the art of the setting of the trap. These guys are trying to set a trap for Daniel, really they don't want him over them. They're sick of this guy being promoted. They're sick of having to listen to him. They're sick of, all this, Daniel has an extraordinary spirit. Daniel has the spirit of the gods living inside of him. Daniel. Like, we're done with Daniel. And so they want to set a trap to do that. And so we have to look at who are they trying to catch in their trap. Well, they were trying to catch the king and Daniel. They're mad that the king sees Daniel and wants to elevate Daniel. They're mad at him. And they're mad at Daniel. They're mad at him for being so great and wonderful. And so here's what they do. Here's the trap. Let's try to find dirt on this godly man. Now, I don't know if you caught it when we read it the first time or we read it the second time. This, more than the lion's den, stands out to me. Their first thing is, okay, let's get some dirt on this guy and let's go to the king and show him that he's corrupt and show him that he made a bad choice and the king will back off. Now, I don't know if these guys hadn't been around, but it's one of those deals like from the time that Daniel's been here, 70 something years, has he ever done anything wrong? Other than like, okay, we're not going to eat the king's food. We're not going to bow to the statue. We're not going to, but it's ridiculous that they think, hey, like the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to go find corruption on this guy. Why do you think that they went the corruption route first?
Because that's how you do it when you're in politics.
It is how you do it when you're politics. But it takes one to know one. Right? Hey, everybody's got dirt. Everybody's got skeletons. I know I do. Let's go find what his are. And they probably went to look. And I love the conversation. They come back and they say, we can't find none. Look what he says. It says, in regards to government affairs, they could not find any ground of accusation or evidence of corruption. He was faithful. There was no negligence. There was no corruption to be found in him. That's a bad day. That's a bad day. Like I'm sure they went and they did a bunch of HR interviews with people and started pulling out people from 25 years ago. I saw you were Daniel's assistant a long time ago. Did he ever, touch you inappropriately? Did he ever speak to you inappropriately? Did he ever text you in an inappropriate way? Like, what's going on with this guy? And Daniel's a great guy. I love my time with, in fact, is there an opening now? Can I go work with Daniel now? Like, he's a great dude. And so they looked and they looked and they dug and they dug and they didn't find anything. That says a lot. Like the fact that we laugh about this, that this is a funny deal, shows us how used we are to having people in positions of power and accountability and authority, and we don't trust them. Like we're just used to it. Like, we're used to having the satraps. Like, that's who we got, and that's just who they are. Like, why does Daniel stand out? He's not these people. In fact, what they say, and I hope you catch this, not only is there not any evidence, but they're saying it's completely against his character. Like, think about this. Daniel was not a Babylonian. Daniel was a Jew. Daniel was a slave who was captured in the war between Babylon and Israel, and he was brought over and brought in, and nobody liked it when it happened then. He was assimilated into the kingdom, taught the ways of their people, and elevated, and yet there's nobody that can say anything bad against this guy. I mean, he was ripe for it. He's a foreigner. He's a slave. You know, like, we should be able to find something against the guy. And here's the thing. Nobody could say anything against him. They couldn't blackmail him. They couldn't accuse him of anything. They couldn't even make it up. They couldn't even make it up. And I want to stop here for just a second, because we look at stuff like this and we think, well, you know, that's just Daniel. We read these things and we begin to feel like maybe we should pattern our lives after Daniel. Maybe we should live in such a way where there's no accusation against us. I mean, here's the thing, like, they came to a place where they recognized that they could level an accusation against Daniel, and you know what would happen when they brought the accusation public? Everybody would be like, you don't know Daniel. If you think Daniel did that, you an idiot. Like, you crazy. Like, they knew. And so we see these things and we start to feel like, well, maybe I should pattern my life after Daniel. And then what we do is we let ourselves off the hook and say, well, I can't be like Daniel. Daniel's in the Bible. God doesn't expect that of me. Well, what made Daniel Daniel? Daniel's not any more special than you are. Daniel's not any more holy than you are. Daniel didn't get, some, measure of grace that you don't get. You know what Daniel did that made him different? Daniel believed what God said, and he believed it so much that he wasn't willing to compromise it. And as we were having this lunch about Daniel at lunch, I said to my, fault that it wouldn't take a lot for somebody to find stuff in my life to discredit me. Sadly. And I feel like I'm a pretty good person. But it wouldn't take a lot. And, it wouldn't take a lot for somebody to say, well, hey, Michael said this, or Michael did that, or I've seen Michael, it doesn't take a lot. But Daniel believed what God said, believed it enough to live it and not compromise in it. That's just what he did. And because he did that, that showed up everywhere in his life. Daniel didn't have this Christianity where he was a person, he was somebody at work, and then he was somebody different when he was at home, and he was somebody different when he was with his people, and he was somebody different when he was trying to be a follower of God. Daniel was the same person. Then he was the same person everywhere. He was the same person in front of the king as he was with the satraps or the magicians or the Chaldeans or whoever it was. He was the same person. And he was the same person because he believed that God wanted him to live a certain way in every area of his life. And listen, we're going to get to the lion's den in a minute, but to me, the biggest miracle is to be able to live in a foreign land where you've been taken against your will with people who hate you, who are trying to destroy you and your people, and to live in such a way that you have integrity that cannot be taken from you by people who hate you. Can I just be real honest? If I was kidnapped and taken to a foreign nation and they were trying to destroy my family and my country, I don't think I would be a person of integrity. I'll just be honest with you. I think I would be doing everything that I could to undermine what they're doing. I would lie, cheat, steal, do whatever I could. He didn't. He didn't. Daniel trusted God. Daniel believed in God, and it showed up everywhere in his life to the point where you see Daniel, and all the way through this, Daniel was doing what was best for Babylon all the time. Let that sink in. Daniel was doing what was best for his enemy. And I'm not talking about fake enemies like we have, enemies on Facebook or, people who don't really like us. I'm talking about legit enemies who have murdered your people and taken over your land, and you are captive to them. And he says, you know what? I trust God. And if God has placed me here, I'm going to be faithful. Because that's the reality. We don't get to the lion's den, that kind of faith, if you're not having that kind of faith in every circumstance and situation. So, we got to come up with a plan. Well, here's the plan. The only way we're going to trap this guy is by his relationship with his God. Now, let that sink in for a second. We're not going to get him in compromise. We're not going to bribe him. We're not going to blackmail him. There's no dirt that we're going to dig up that we can, find from TMZ and we're going to put it on, and bust some story. There's not going to be that. So here's the thing we're going to do. The only constant in his life that we know we can get him is his relationship with his God. Like, that just eats me up. I would love for somebody to look at my life and say that. The only way we're going to get him is we're going to have to figure out something to kind of put a wedge between him and his God. That's the only way we're going to do it. So here's their plan. They come up with a stupid plan, just like Nebuchadnezzar came up with a stupid plan on his statue. We're going to attack prayer. They go to Darius and say, listen, king, and I still, as I look at this, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and we'll get into this in just a second. But they come to him and say, king, here's what we need you to do. It's come to our attention that people are praying to other gods. They're, looking for other people for, help and safety. And so, you should be the only person that they're talking to for those kind of things. They should be petitioning you for help. They should be petitioning you for their needs. We shouldn't be talking to anybody else. So here's what we're going to do. For 30 days, you're going to outlaw prayer completely. Nobody can pray to any God at any time other than you. Now, understand that these guys are the same guys that we've been hearing from for the last 5 chapters. They're the sorcerers and magicians and rulers and people and all this kind of stuff who have their own gods. And I want you to think about this for just a second. We are so angry at Daniel and we're so willing to get him that we're willing to say that nobody can pray to their gods for 30 days. What does that say about your prayer life? And what does that say about prayer life with your God? That your God's going to be cool with you just not praying for 30 days. Oh, and not only not praying to them, but only going to Darius and asking for help. So they present that. And they also come and say, oh yeah, and by the way, everybody's on board. We've talked to everybody. Because I bet what would have happened is that they said, well, Daniel's not on board. I think Darius would have had some questions. Because he's considering him to be second in command. We're going to, elevate him over the entire nation. He's probably going to have some questions, but here's what they said. Hey, talk to everybody, and everybody's okay with it. And he's assuming Daniel's okay with it. It's kind of that, thing that kids do with their parents, I'm going to go ask mom, and if mom says no, then I'm going to go tell dad that mom said it's okay, and dad's going to be like, okay, if mom says okay, it's okay, right? We don't check. That's what he did. All right. Now, this will come up a lot later in Esther, but they're kind of prefacing for you here. I love foreshadowing. This is a great thing. There's the thing with the Persian people, the Medes and the Persians, they talk about that. There's this thing, and it's really stupid, and you're going to see it comes up here, and it comes up in Esther. They have this thing in their law that when a king writes a decree, an injunction, whatever, once the king writes that, he signs it, he stamps it, it becomes law, and you can never change it. Ever. You can't come back and go, hey, that was stupid. I probably need to change this. Nope, can't do it. Because if you'll remember in Esther, basically they, made a law that, if a wife doesn't, do what her husband wants to do, then you can throw her out and all this kind of stuff, like just craziness. And then they made a law where, let's just kill all the Jews in every place in the kingdom. If there's Jews around, just kill them, burn their houses down, take everything they have. And then the king finds out Esther's a Jew, and he's like, oh, I want to take it back, but he can't, right? Now, so they trap him. They tell him, hey, everybody's cool with this. We've talked to everybody. Everybody's cool. Can you do this? He does it, and he signs it, moves on, doesn't think about it. Daniel finds out. Listen to this. Verse 10, Daniel knew the document was signed. He entered his house in the rooftop chamber that faced Jerusalem. He continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God as he had been doing previously. Daniel doesn't stop praying. He doesn't go to the king. He doesn't start a protest. He doesn't try to find a representative to, let's change this law. Daniel just does what he always does. He didn't make a scene. In fact, here's the thing, probably the only way that they knew he prayed was that they watched him. They were looking for things in his life. And so they thought, okay, well, this is it. And they were right. As soon as he hears what happens, what's the first thing that he does? It's not a trick question. What does he do? He prays. Prays 3 times a day. He goes and gets on his face before God and says, God, here we go again. And I love this. It gives us 2 different things that happens in Daniel's prayer. It says that he was praying and giving thanks before his God as he had been doing previously. Like, again, here we are. Like, all of us want to be powerful prayer warriors, and we talk about that, and all of us want to do those kind of things, but the reality is, do we want to do the work to make that happen? He did 3 times a day. He'd stop what he's doing. He'd go to his home. He'd face Jerusalem, and he'd pray. You know? Now, the great thing is we don't have to do that. We can stop and pray anytime we want to. In fact, you can be praying right now. God, help Michael get finished early so we can go home. Right? And God answers those prayers. Like, that's good. But he didn't stop praying. He didn't fight. He didn't stop. And here's what I want you to think. How difficult would this be? Here we go again. I'm 83 years old. Again? Like we're doing this again? 83 years old. And he goes and begins to pray. And he doesn't make a spectacle about it. Doesn't pitch a fit, doesn't scream and yell, doesn't get on Instagram and TikTok and tell everybody how mad he is and try to make it go viral. But it says he prayed and gave thanks, and then he also had petitions and supplications. Like that habit of going to God and thanking him for what's going on in your life. That develops a habit. And for 70 years in a foreign land, working for terrible kings and dealing with people, like not just workplace backstabbing, and we've all had that, but have you had an employee or a colleague at work try to murder you? He has multiple times. Like, you know? And yet here's what he does. He goes, God, thank you. I praise you for who you are, and I praise you for how you're involved in my life, and I thank you for the ways that you work. And then begins to ask, God, work. God, move. God, take care of this. Well, not only was Daniel caught by this degree, but Darius was as well. Now, we really don't know how much time has passed since Daniel 5 to Daniel 6. A lot of times we read that and we think it's like the next day. It's not the next day. There's some time that has passed. I mean, Daniel's had to have some time to show himself faithful and godly and amazing to Darius, where Darius trusts him because, you know, Darius is a foreign king or foreign governor coming in for the foreign king. But whatever's happened, there's been enough time where Darius not only sees Daniel as this amazing man, but seems to come to have loved him and maybe call him a friend. And so the guys come and they approach the king and, you know, play dumb. Hey, king, you know, we were talking the other day, like, didn't you write an injunction the other day, like that people weren't supposed to pray? Oh, yeah, I did do that. Why? Well, Daniel's praying. Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. Yeah, these guys are like toddlers, man. It's like preschool, you know? Daniel's praying, and he doesn't listen to you. And listen to what he says. As soon as the king heard this, verse 14, as soon as the king heard this, he was deeply distressed and set his mind on delivering Daniel. And even until sunset, he kept exerting himself to rescue Daniel. I mean, he knew that there was nothing he could do. He knew it because he had written it, he had signed it, he had sealed it, he had said it, and now there it is. I can't change this. And yet here's this guy who is in power and authority and control, and he's sweating bullets. How can I figure this out? What can I do? How can I save him? Well, these guys let him stew for several hours, and they come back to him and say, hey, you got no loopholes here, man. You either do what you said you were going to do, that you have to do now because you've made it law. It is law. And do you want to break the law? Because we can call Cyrus. We can call the king and tell the king, and I don't think he's going to be too happy about this. And he gave the order. Now, he says something that's pretty amazing. He says, and we'll get to this, we'll kind of come back to this in a second, but to frame all this, basically what Darius says to Daniel is this: only God can deliver you now. Now I want you to think about this. This should be causing alarm bells to go off in your head. Have you heard this somewhere before? Do you remember Nebuchadnezzar? There is no God that can save you now. And Darius says something opposite. Only your God can save you now. Like, there's nothing else I can do. I've exhausted all the appeals. I've exhausted all the stuff. There is nothing. This is happening. And it's almost like he's saying, okay, if your God's real, we're going to find out. So Daniel gets thrown in the lion's den. Now, I want to talk about this for a second because a lot of the pictures that we think about, especially the ones that we do with the little kids, like we see Daniel kind of strolling into the lion's den. That's not what happened. They had a couple of entrances that would work with a lion's den. They would find a cave, and they would bore out a hole at the top of the cave, and that's where you would feed the lions. So the lions would expect, this is where I go, and this is where food comes. We push the rock off there. We drop meat down in there, and when meat hits the ground, guess what? It's time to eat. Now notice it says they took Daniel to the hole of the cave and tossed him in. How old is Daniel? 83. Anybody in here in their 60s like to get dropped down in a hole? Anybody want to do that? Volunteer? Like, that's what they did. They grab him, they move the stone, and when the stone moves, what are the lions saying? Dinner. It's dinner time, right? And he gets dropped. Now here's the deal. Yes, it is a miracle that the mouths of the lions were shut. Now we're going to get later on, it says that Daniel was not harmed. Not only did God protect him from the lions, he protected him from the fall. We don't know how many feet it was from the top to the bottom, but he fell and he didn't get hurt. And they didn't pounce on him. Now, you would imagine that they would have heard, I'm sure they heard him hit, and I'm sure he was like, oh, my back, because I probably would have been that. But they push the stone and they sign it, seal it, do all this kind of stuff so that nothing could be done. Like, this is another kind of one of those foreshadowing things like what's going to happen with Jesus. We've put all the official seals on here. He's locked in. Nothing can happen. Like he is, fed to his fate. And I love what happened with the king. The king went home and he couldn't sleep. Not only could he not sleep, it says he fasted. He didn't get any of his fine food. He didn't have any of his wonderful desserts. He didn't have people waiting on him hand and foot. He was inconsolable. He had no entertainment, no dancers, no singers, no nothing. Like, shut it all down. I don't want any of it. And then he can't sleep. He tosses and turns all night because he's hoping on hope that Daniel will be okay. So we get the thing where he comes the next morning. and I love this. So we have to see here that something's happened to Darius where he would even go. Because we know the story, we take these things for granted. Like, here's a guy who does not know God. Here's a guy who has not really seen God work. The Babylonians have. They've seen God work through Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. This guy hadn't. Do you realize the faith that it took for him to leave the castle and go check? Because, honestly, if you tell me that you're going to throw somebody in a hole and there's a bunch of lions in there and then ask me to go check on one in the morning, I'm going to say, no thanks. I don't want to clean up that mess. Thank you. But he did. He went. And they moved the stone and he bends down into the hole. Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions? And Daniel says, yes. Daniel said, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they've not harmed me. Inasmuch as I was found innocent before him and also toward you, O king, I have committed no crime. Daniel, did your God save you? And I just love that answer. Yeah, he did. Now, am I crazy, man? This is just me. I don't know if I'd been Daniel, and he calls down, I don't know if I would have waited a minute. Just let it be silent. Daniel, oh no, I'm here. It's all good. But no, he answers. And then his answer is very important. He says, God sent his angel. Now, that's what Daniel thought. But the person that God sent was the same person who was in the fire. God sent Jesus. And Jesus came down and he shut the mouth of the lions and he spent the night with Daniel. I don't know. I don't know that I would want to be thrown in a lion's den, but if I got to have that time with Jesus, I think I might risk it. That's what happened. He says, he shut the mouths of the lion. I'm completely fine. And he adds on, which I'm glad he did. He says, oh, by the way, the reason that God saved me is because I'm innocent. In case you didn't recognize. I'm innocent before him, and I'm innocent before you. King was very pleased and gave orders for Daniel to be taken up out of the den. Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him because he had trusted in his God. Then the king gave orders, and they brought those men who had maliciously accused Daniel, and they cast them, their children, and their wives into the lion's den, and they had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. So this is what normally happens in the lion's den, right? Darius destroys these men and their families. Now, I want to say, and this is important, people will also come to a passage like this and say, see, the Bible's cruel. God did this. God didn't do this. This was a human king who was mad, and he does what humans do. I'm going to get revenge. You almost cost me my most prized counsel, the person that I was going to have over everything, that I trusted more than anybody, and you almost took that away from me. Well, let me show you what I'm going to do to you. And I'm going to take you and your wives and your children. Now, here's what we need to understand. Just because the Bible contains something doesn't mean the Bible condones something. We see this all over the Bible. We see people taking matters in their own hands and doing crazy things. God never says, hey, I'm okay with that. You should do that. We see people doing horrible things all the time. Just because the Bible contains it does not mean the Bible condones it, okay? And so this guy did what kings did. He does what rulers do. These guys had threatened his rule, and so what do? We take out the competition. If this is the way you're going to be, I'm going to take you out. It's an example. This is what you do when you cross me. Now, as I kind of told you before, after this happens, Darius writes a new decree. You can't undo the old one, but you can do a new one. Now, I talked to this a little bit of foreshadowing. This is what happens in Esther. The decree goes out that at the end of the month, everybody on one day can go out and they can kill all the Jews. They're not going to be charged with murder. They're not going to go to jail. There's not going to be any trials. You can burn down their house. You can take all their possessions. You can do all their things. And Xerxes knew he can't undo that. So he wrote another decree. And basically what he said is that the day before that day, all the Jews can get together and they can get weapons and they can do all this kind of stuff and be prepared to protect themselves when people showed up at their houses. So what do you think happened to all those people who thought, at the end of the month, we're going to go purge? They didn't go. They stayed home. Because now they knew that the Jews were going to be able to protect themselves. Now, he didn't change the decree. He wrote a new one. But he wrote a new one in a way that would protect the Jews and allow them to protect themselves. Darius does the same thing. Actually, Darius writes this new decree, and it's more like a hymn. It's more like a praise song to God. Verse 25, Darius the king wrote to all the people, nations, and men of every language who are living in all the land, may your peace abound. I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom, men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and enduring forever. His kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. His dominion will be forever. He delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has also delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. I mean, it's a pretty awesome decree. He signed it. He sealed it. He said it. It's now law and it can't be changed. And he said some pretty powerful stuff. Now, we don't know if Darius comes to faith in God and changes his life. We don't know that. We don't see that. But it seems like he's learned some things about God. First, he says, fear and tremble before him. There's a lot of gods that they worshiped and a lot of gods that they prayed to that they didn't fear and tremble because they're just these fat, bloated, sassy gods that don't care anything about them. And you just, sacrifice them. Maybe they help, maybe they don't. This God's different. This God cares. Like, I think one of the things that Darius has recognized is that this God knows your name. And that's a good thing, and it can also be a bad thing. This God knows who you are. And you should fear and tremble before him. He is the living God. He is the living God who rescues and performs signs and wonders. Now, he's making a pretty powerful theological statement here. He is saying, now he's not saying he's the only one, but here's what he's saying. Out of all the gods I know, he's the only one that's alive. Out of all the gods I know, he's the only one who rescues. Out of all the gods I know, he's the only one that has performed signs and wonders and miracles. He's the only one. This is a great decree. And he's basically saying anyone who is under the care and protection or enslavement, however you want to call it, of Persia now, you need to fear this God, you need to tremble before him, and you need to recognize that he is the only living God who rescues. Now, this guy has learned some stuff. In fact, I think it might do us well to learn some stuff from him too. You know, I don't want to belittle our troubles because we all have them, but the thing that we need to recognize is that we have placed our faith and hope and trust in the only living God in the universe. There is nobody else. There is nobody else who rescues. And, you know, I joked earlier about being in the lion's den and having Jesus come and how great that would be, but can I tell you that actually it's much better for us than Daniel? Because he doesn't come just visit us. The Holy Spirit lives inside of us. God himself has made his home in us if we believe in Jesus. One of the saddest things in the Old Testament, if you hadn't noticed or have never seen, the Holy Spirit would come on people and empower them and give them power, and then he would leave. Can you imagine that? Could you imagine having that depth of presence and relationship where the Holy Spirit would come and he would give you power and be able to do these things, and then he would leave? No, we don't understand that. Why don't we understand that? Because the Holy Spirit, when he comes to us, he never leaves. So here's the thing. We serve the only living God. We serve the God who rescues and performs signs and wonders. God is with us in our troubles. The question is, do you believe this? Daniel believed that he was going to get thrown in the lion's den, and I'm probably sure he said something to the effect of, hey, look, throw me in the lion's den or not, God will save me or not, but I'm not gonna stop doing what I'm doing, and God's gonna do what he's gonna do. And God did. But God is with us in our trouble. Do you believe that? And I love this line. It almost seems like a throwaway line. It says, Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Daniel enjoyed success with Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel enjoyed success with Belshazzar. Daniel enjoyed success. And it kind of hurts my heart because Daniel enjoyed his success in the most terrible circumstance. And I mean, God has blessed me and my family mightily, and I just look for stuff to complain about. I'm not a captive. I don't live in a foreign land. People aren't trying to kill me that I know of. Right? But Daniel enjoyed success. God made him successful. God grew him and God blessed him even in the worst of circumstances. He did that. So, here's a question I want to leave you with. What might God want to do with your life? I haven't really honed in on this, but I bet when Daniel was a little kid and he was thinking about his life plan, I don't think slave was on his agenda. I don't think growing up in Babylon, I don't think, having his life be on the line. But yet that's exactly what God wanted to do in his life because God was using him to speak to these foreign nations. And again, we're going to get to this, but you know the end of that, right? We have three, and we don't know if there's probably more, but we have three wise men or three magi that show up at the birth of Jesus because they were following Daniel's star. Daniel's going to prophesy in a couple of chapters about a star that's going to come, that's going to show you that the King of all kings and the Lord of all lords is coming. And so we're talking about hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years after Daniel's gone. But what God wanted to do in Daniel's life was to place him in a place where people had never heard God's name, don't know his power, don't know who he is. So God can display that through Daniel so that hundreds of years down the road, people would go and find the Messiah. People who weren't Jews, who weren't the Pharisees, who weren't the religious leaders. In fact, they would be looked at as enemies. God calls his enemies to come and meet his son before anybody else. What does God want to do with your life? What habits are you creating to be a faithful person? Daniel had habits. He prayed, and he continued to pray, and he believed God, and he lived the way that God wanted him to live, when it was easy, when it was tough, when people were looking, when they weren't. What habits are you creating? And here it is. Does it give you comfort to know that only God can save you?
Amen.
Does it give you comfort to know that? So I want you to think about those. What does God want to do with your life? What habits are you creating? And does it give you comfort to know that God is the only one that can save you? I told you Sunday, and I'll repeat it again. I'm hard-headed. I like to learn the hard way. And I hope that I'm much closer to learning this lesson and resting in this lesson, that only God can save me. Because I really have a high opinion of myself and how I can save myself. Even though my track record is horrendous. Like anybody else, I would look at their track record and be like, stop making decisions. Stop it. Stop trying to save you're like, you are bad at it. And every time something comes along, I'm like, I can do it. I got it. And where we need to be is just remember, no. I don't got it, but God does. Any questions or comments or anything before we go? Yes, ma'am.
It's not a comment about this, but I got in here late. I wanted to share, I have a granddaughter in the Air Force in Italy. She had major surgery today,
Okay.
and she's going to be in the hospital for at least 3 days. She has no family over there, and other than airman friends, she has no friends over there to be with her. I just want to lift her up. She's in a lot of pain,
Okay.
but her surgery went well.
And what's your granddaughter's name?
Jada.
Jaya. Pray for Jaya. She's in the Air Force, and she's over in Italy, and she's had a pretty major surgery and doesn't have a lot of people there. So let's be praying for her. She's in a lot of pain. Okay? Yep. Yes.
Do you believe that most of the characters in the Bible were like Daniel? In other words, he was glorified in the toughness of his life.
Yeah. Good question. So he was asking, do I think that most of the characters of the Bible are like Daniel, that through the hardships of his life, his faith grew and things like that? Yeah, because that's what happens to us too. And we don't see in Daniel's life, I don't want to pretend like Daniel was perfect. He's a human, he wasn't. But we look at all of God's people throughout the Old Testament and New Testament, and we can do some really amazing and wonderful things when we trust God, and we can do some really horrible things when we don't. And so I think the lesson for us is that, yes, we're going to learn and grow through difficulties. We're going to learn and grow through tragedy. We're going to learn and grow through, circumstances. But also we need to recognize that when we stop learning and we stop growing and we stop listening to God, then things get really bad. Great question. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
It doesn't say that Daniel slept that night. Obviously the king didn't, but Daniel probably slept fine. I'm thinking of Peter when he was in prison between two guards. And he was supposed to be killed the next day.
Yeah.
He was snoozing away.
Yeah, that's a great, and maybe Daniel was. I mean, what a picture would that be, if they could come in and see and he's like all snuggled up between the lions and, he's like, man, that was the warmest blanket I've ever had. Like, that was awesome, So yeah, it's,
Lions coats.
yeah, I mean, like that is, we see all throughout the Old Testament where it talks about that when we put our faith and trust in God, we can sleep. That was kind of like, David talked about that a lot. I trust in you and therefore I'm going to go to sleep. And we're like, that doesn't make any sense. It makes the best sense. Here's what he's saying. I trust you so much that I can go and actually get a good night's rest because you're dealing with my problems. Right? So, yeah, that's a great observation. Anybody else?
It's kind of weird, not weird, but this is the same as what Jesus went through. They were trying to kill him using his relationship with God. They did the same thing with Daniel.
Yeah.
Not that Daniel was Jesus.
No.
That's
Well, I mean, we
the same
see
kind of thing.
God gives us these pictures all throughout the Old Testament of people going through trials and troubles that Jesus is going to go through. And I mean, Joseph, the life of Joseph, there's so many things there that parallel the life of Jesus, you know. And so that's not surprising, you know, that God kind of helps us to see that these are some themes that kind of keep coming back up and keep coming back up because they're always pointing past that person. Daniel's not the Savior. Daniel's not the Messiah. He's saved by the Messiah. He's not the Messiah. And so all this stuff points past him. And so we're like, well, that's cool. Somebody else is coming that's going to be even better. Same thing with David. Like, David is the king of all kings until the Messiah comes, right? And so we look at, and so like the Old Testament going into the New Testament, you know, going into Jesus' time, they were looking for a king like David. Yeah. All right. Thank you guys for coming tonight. Let's pray and we'll be dismissed. Father, thank you for our time together. And I just pray that you would help us to take what we learned, let it sink deeply into our heart and to spring forth into action in our lives. God bless us. Help us to take what we know and to share it with those who need it. And it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.